בקצרה, אני רק רוצה להודות שוב לאביטל, לאיילת, לכל מי שיש לו יד ורגל בארגון האירוע הזה, באמת יוצא מן הכלל, and to thank Robert Coolidge again for the fascinating and very inspiring talk. And now Nancy Shute. She started a journalism career at the age of 12, which is about 10 years ago, when she published an independent newspaper with her friends. Later she took this experience almost as far as one can go. She established a newspaper in Kamchatka, that's the farthest point in Russia, in the eastern Russia. Before she started her career as a science journalist, she obtained a bachelor's degree in English literature from Washington University, and then a master's degree in law from Yale Law School. Later she worked in various media, television, newswires, magazines. She covered various topics from virtually every part of the world. Recently she was working she started working on science and health issues for institutions such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, National Review. She's been working many years in the News and World Report, US News and World Report magazine. She was the director of science and technology coverage, as well as assistant managing editor. And she's also a regular contributor to the NPR, the National Public Radio, National Geographic, Scientific American. Nancy Shute teaches scientific writing at Johns Hopkins University, and she's the recipient of many prizes and awards in journalism. During her career, she was also very active in the NASW, the National Association of Science Writers, and now she's the president of this very important organization. One of her major feats was establishing tools and opportunities for science writers to adjust and work in the rapidly changing world of new media, and that will be the subject of her talk. Nancy, when you need to shoot, talk.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me here. It's just a thrill to be here in Israel for the first time, and amongst all of you, where we share so much in common. And I'm thrilled to be following Robert, who showed us just how much you can achieve if you put your heart and soul and your creativity in trying to explain to the world and show the world just how beautiful science really is. But that's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge for all of us, and particularly now with the state of journalism changing so much, both in the United States, where Robert and I work, and in Israel and the rest of the world. And that's something that I've been struggling with as someone who's been working as a journalist for my entire adult life, and also as someone who has been involved as a volunteer with journalism organizations in the United States, thinking, you know, what are we going to do with our profession, with our craft? Are we going to be able to ever make a living again? What will we do? How will we do it? Why? It's raising profound questions about why journalism exists, and should science journalism continue to exist? If so, how will we do it? Robert showed us one way that we could do that that's very exciting, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the forces that are acting on American journalism right now, and how we're struggling in our own way to try to figure out how to deal with that. So it used to be when Robert and I started out in journalism, it was great. You call up a scientist, they would answer your phone call, because the only way they could get the story about their research out to the public was by talking to the press. They didn't always like us, it wasn't always very comfortable, but they returned our phone calls. It was great. And it was wonderful for journalists because we controlled access to the publishing platform, right? You had to go through us to get on TV or in the newspaper, and this was a great deal, right? It was a lot of fun. Interesting subjects, you know, learn a lot. Every day on the job, I was satisfying my own curiosity. This is a great thing. You know, and we had this really great technology. It was cheap, you know, it was proven technology. We knew how to make money with it. It was a great business model. Alas, that has changed. This is some data from the Pew Research Center showing how in the last decade in the United States, we went through this profound change in how people get news. The top line, you see there, that's how people watch news traditionally most people got their news in the United States and still do, including science news, on television, broadcast news, and also cable TV. And then newspapers were next, and then radio, and it's not on this in this particular chart, but you know, magazines were down there below newspapers, but still pretty steady. You know, people got a lot of their news that way. So as you can see, you know, and all of a sudden, starting in 1991, the newspaper and radio start this precipitous drop from over, you know, almost 60% in some cases down into the 30s, like lost more than half of their audience. At the same time, you see this, you know, orange line all of a sudden zooming up, and that's online news. It just, you know, kind of poof appeared out of nowhere and quickly became a dominant form of news media, where before we had, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years of press, over almost 100 years of television, almost as much of radio. You know, this has just quickly eclipsed traditional news forms. And then you see that little red dot that appeared there in about 2009, web or mobile. Kablam, 44% of Americans now say they get their news on mobile platforms. So that's within the last 3 years. Mobile is now accounting for about 50% of news users in the United States. These are extraordinary changes in technology, and we as individuals and as a media business have had a really hard time keeping up. So what about science news? This is data from the National Science Foundation, which does science and engineering indicators. They're really useful data if you like to look at this sort of thing, see where people get science news and science information. As you see, you know, this is going from 2001 to 2010, pretty much the same data set. See, television is still, you know, they've lost some market, but they're still holding in there pretty well. Again, newspapers, you know, slow but sure decline there. And then again, the internet picked up and they actually eclipsed, according to this data, newspapers in like 2007. What about science and technology? Because that's what we really care about, right? You can see then again, people were much more quickly, you know, also adapting internet, television, the same. What I think is really interesting here is this last one where we say specific science news. If you want to look up something you're specifically interested in, people very quickly went to search on the internet and realized that it could be a really great source of information. So the kind of people who are interested in reaching now, they're still using television to get news, science news, but they're increasingly using the web and mobile platforms, and they want to direct their own search for information, so they're on the web and they're Googling and they're doing the searches themselves. Very, very different delivery form from expecting the newspaper to land on your doorstep every morning and letting people like me control what you read and how you read it. So, big problem with this transformation is that the old business model worked very well, it was very lucrative. People were reluctant to give up something that worked well and paid them a lot of money, right? No one has really yet figured out the business model for mass media production of news in the United States. As you can see here, newspapers are losing vast amounts of money. The Washington Post, which is my hometown newspaper, the only reason it's still publishing is that they also own a test prep company called Stanley Kaplan that'll help you study for your academic exams, and that's actually keeping the Washington Post afloat. And as you see, well, you think online news looks pretty good. Unfortunately, almost all of that revenue is still going to search engines like Google and social media sites like Facebook. So a little tiny bit of that trickles down to news organizations, but it's not the cash cow that broadcast television and newspaper once was. The reason that's important is because that cash flow helps pay for the reporters, the editors, the videographers, all the people you need to actually produce the news. So, and cable TV, you know, and audio and radio also, you know, they're hanging in there, but it's not a good situation. To do good news reporting, you need money. It's not a cheap enterprise. So the good news is, for all of us, is that people are interested in medicine, science, and innovation. They want to hear about it, and poll after poll shows this. It's not the most important thing, but it consistently hangs in there over the years. This is more data from the National Science Foundation, and they were asking them about different issues to see where it ranked. People, if you ask them about the constellation of science-y things they want to know about, weather is usually at the top. No surprise there. medical discoveries because they affect you. You want to hear about heart disease or diabetes or cosmetic surgery, whatever it is. Then you look at this, that medical discoveries ranked above interest in local school issues, above pollution, interestingly enough, above economic issues. And I was surprised at that, especially considering what we've gone through in the United States. Scientific discovery, new inventions, technology above defense policy, above ag news, no surprise there. And even above space exploration for those of us who grew up in the astronaut age, that seems like a surprise. And also above international news, perhaps because the United States is fairly parochial on that. But that's the kind of information you could say, okay, it's worth, people are interested in it, we think this is important information to get out to the public. This should work, right? We should be able to meld these two people. But the not so good news in the current news climate, if you think to that slide I had a few minutes ago saying most people are still getting their science news from television. I mean, this is what people think of when they think of science news on television in the United States. Okay? It's Shark Week on the Discovery Channel. This is the highest rated science television news show in the United States. And I guess it's good news if you're a marine biologist. I don't know. if you're a shark, because it's usually the shark is eating someone. But it's not what I think about as high-quality science news, and I don't think it's really imparting much information to people. It's really an entertainment show. There's an awful lot of science news journalism on the web, some of which is good, but a great deal of it, I'm sorry to say, is like something like this. This is the Huffington Post, which is both a digital-only news aggregator, also has some original reporting. This was a story they did last month about the 5-second rule. Do you know who knows what the 5-second rule is? Yeah. It's like supposedly if it falls on the floor, you pick it up within 5 seconds, you can still eat it. Well, first of all, that's been disproven, like years and years ago. It keeps coming back because people love it. And it says 5-second rule put to the test in new study. Well, the study wasn't really a study. It was something that was done by one woman who worked in a lab in the UK, and there was no data set, there was no control group, and the study, such as it was financed by a company that made mops. Okay, so none of that information is here. If you read the entire article, you would think this was actually a real study from a real university that involved real research, and it wasn't biased by its funder. The Brits, the British get beaten up a lot for the poor quality of their science journalism. The British articles actually said that and actually said that this was financed by the mop company. The Americans, no, we left that out. So the other problem we have is that, we're still trying to, both as scientists and science journalists, try to force science down people's throats. We think it's good for them. They should be literate. They should be informed citizens. They really should get this stuff. And damn it, we're going to make sure they do, right? And I think there's one basic reason why that happens that affects both journalists and scientists. As a journalist, I love facts. I revere facts. I think if you give people high-quality factual information, they will be better informed and they will be able to make better decisions. Okay, that's my whole reason to be a journalist. Scientists, pretty much the same thing, right? You want to figure out how the world works. You go out there, you think of the question you want to answer, you think of how you're going to answer that question, you gather your data, you analyze your data, you present your data to the world, and the world's going to figure out how it works and make good use of that. Some scientists love data so much that they actually tattoo it on themselves. And Carl Zimmer has written a wonderful book about gathering the tattoos of scientists. You'd be pretty amazed at what they have on their bodies. So we love facts, we love data. But data doesn't convince people, and very often it doesn't even inform people. Who can tell me what this picture is of? Do you know? Yeah. Yeah. And what happened? Yeah. What happened to her? Yeah. Okay. It was a girl in the Vietnam War whose skin was burned with napalm, and she's living in America. He's exactly right. That picture was taken 40 years ago this year. He remembers everything about it. Do you think he can tell me what the current state of the debate in the United States is about climate change? Probably not. I mean, the reason that that picture sticks in our minds so profoundly is that it's shocking. There's a feeling. I remember seeing that picture as a kid when it first came out, and I wanted to know everything about it. Who is that girl? What happened to her? Could that happen to me? Why would adults let something like that happen? I still remember that 40 years later. And there's a growing body of social science looking at the question of communication and how we understand and communicate. Robert alluded to this earlier in terms of how ideas stick in your brain. We're really getting down to the granular neuroscience level of this. And it's not good news for us as journalists or as scientists if we're trying to convince people of what's real and what's true by using facts or data. That's not how people's brains work. There's a researcher at the University of Michigan who I heard last month at a conference in Wisconsin, who I thought did a really good job of explaining this. And if you want to delve more deeply into this, I'd encourage you to go find his work and look at it. I mean, he really can spell it out for you exactly how that process of paying attention works, and shows you how pathetically tiny the window of attention people have in their lives. And then if you're going to grab that, you have to do the sorts of things that Robert and Jad are doing, where they're using humor, feeling, emotion, surprise, all the things that really grab horror, all the things like that photograph, the things that really grab us as people. And so what Dr. Lupia said is that, people look for things that support their worldview, their feelings and emotions, even if it's not objectively sound, even if it doesn't make any sense at all. I'm going to cherry pick out the data, the facts that make sense to me in my worldview, and I'm going to ignore everything else. That's become a real problem for us in the United States when we talk about communicating science to the public, because a lot of the issues that we're trying hard to communicate on are very emotional, and they're very contested. You can talk about whether people believe in climate change. You look at the data in Europe, people say, oh, yeah, of course climate change is real and we have to do something. We have to do a lot of things to ameliorate that. You ask the same question in the United States, the majority of the people say, nah, I don't think so, and I don't see how it affects me, and I don't see that there's anything I could do about it, so I'm going to ignore it. So it's also become a huge issue when you talk about vaccine safety and public health, which is something I've written about a lot. You can write about study after study after study, and a significant proportion of the American public is going to say, no, I'm a parent, I know what's right for my children, I think I know better than the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I'm not going to vaccinate my children. And this is happening not in people who are poorly educated or from a low socioeconomic category. It's the most educated and the most affluent people in the United States who are saying, no, I'm not going to listen to science, I'm not going to vaccinate my children. And we tend to say, well, it's because this actress named Jenny McCarthy is saying that. But it's more complex than that. It's people saying, I'm making up my own mind about this, and I think I'm doing what's right for me. But it's based on emotion and feeling. It's not based on the facts of public health. So this is a difficult situation. We've had this violent transformation in technology in the past decade, which has really destroyed the economic model for journalism that worked very well for us for many years. And we're also dealing with a situation where people are biologically and emotionally averse to new information. So if you want to tell me something new and different from what I've heard before and what I believe, you're going to have to work really hard at it. And you're going to have to think different ways to do that. So I've been struggling with this myself for years and trying to figure out what to do, talking to a lot of people, talking to people in different countries. We're all going through the same thing, perhaps in different ways. In Central America, people aren't on the web, but they're trying hard to figure out how to keep newspapers going. Other countries like Israel and the US, we're very deeply into mobile news right now, but haven't quite figured out how to make that work as an industry. So I've come up with 3 things that I think we should be thinking about as journalists and as science communicators. One is we need to deliver science news to the forums, in the forms that people want it. If people are going with mobile, we should be there. We should be out there ahead of them. If people want podcasts, then we should be podcasting. And we should be experimenting with those forms too and saying, well, what's the next podcast? What would people want to do next? Let's try that. Let's set up something and try that out and see if, in fact, that technology is going to be a good tool for us to use, because these are all tools. And then experiment with new forms of storytelling to help people connect science with their feeling and belief. And there's a lot of different interesting experiments going on that in the United States right now. I think we could do a lot more. Robert gave you some beautiful examples in his own work. And I think another thing, too, is for us to become much more entrepreneurial about how we address these issues, whether it's thinking of ourselves as journalists who are going to start some sort of new invention, project, business, but also as scientists and institutions, too, to think about experimenting with this, being willing to fail, and then go on to the next thing and repeat it again. So here are some people who are doing interesting things that I wanted to point out to you. You might want to keep an eye on. Carl is one of the journalists who contributes to Radiolab. He writes for the New York Times regularly. He writes for Discover, so he's a traditional print journalist. He's mastered the art of social media for communicating to people. And I think that Facebook is like the best free publishing platform ever. I just started working on a project with NPR that's going to be largely Facebook-based because it's aimed at young people. It's aimed at people under 30. And he's now doing a book about science tattoos. He's self-publishing some of his books. He's doing ebooks to see how that works as opposed to the traditional New York City publishing form. So here's somebody who's keeping the old media going while he's experimenting with every way possible he can think of to use new forms of technology. This I thought was interesting because as the newspaper and magazine media have died off in the United States, we've lost many, many, many good science reporters at small to medium-sized newspapers. Most of those organizations don't have any science reporter at all. They might have a health reporter who covers, kind of soft consumer health things, but very often they won't have anybody covering science. And so a lot of the news that used to be disseminated through the newspapers and then would get picked up by radio and TV in local markets, which are a very powerful source of news in the United States. That's not happening. This is a consortium of research universities in the United States who decided by golly, they would just publish their own press releases. This looks like a news site. It's beautifully done. You would have to read the fine print to realize that it's actually an aggregator of university press releases. But they have decided to just skip the middleman, not use journalists, and go directly to the public with this. This happens in a number of other countries too, particularly in Europe. As a journalist, I'm a little bit nervous about this because you're taking away my job. But I think it's a worthy experiment to keep an eye on and think about other ways that research institutions can communicate and engage with the public, given the fact that the model of journalism that many institutions thought was there, you call up the local reporter, they come out, they talk to your scientists, then you have a nice feature in the paper the next day. That's just not happening anymore. And if it is, that reporter is probably a young metro reporter who doesn't know anything about your institution or the particular field of science, and they're going to have to really struggle to get the science right. So one thing that my organization, the National Association of Science Writers, has put a lot of time and effort into in the last few years is educating ourselves and trying to educate other journalists and think about how to make it easier for journalists to cover science if they don't have the grounding and background and experience that people did in the past, and try to improve the quality of the coverage overall through that. This is another experiment. This is an organization called ProPublica. It's privately funded by a wealthy couple, and they were very disturbed to see that there was very little investigative, in-depth reporting on science in the environment and medicine going on because of the collapse of the news industry in the United States. So they have deep pockets. They started this new organization for investigative reporting, and it partners with groups like NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, does in-depth investigations, and then they're published not only in the partner organization, but also on their website. And if you notice here on this site, they also say you can buy their reports. You can get them for free on the website, but if you want, you could also buy them as, online for your Kindle as a Kindle single, so you can read them on your ebook as well. So they're experimenting with multiple platforms. Mobile, I know that, everybody's trying to figure out what to do with mobile right now. NPR has a number of apps they're working on, and right now they're pretty much just straight news feeds where it's taking everything we have on our website and chopping it up into nice little pieces. But we're experimenting with ways to make those more interactive and tailored for people's needs. And you're going to see a lot more of that in the future in the United States and also, I think, in Israel. I'd be interested to hear what's going on here, because I know you're really ahead of us in a lot of apps. There's a reason I put a slide about Homicide Watch here. I think that science journalists have really missed the boat in how we deal with data. I think we very much use the traditional approach that Robert talked about earlier. I read the paper, I interview the scientist, I think about it, I write a beautifully crafted article, it goes up on the NPR website, I've done my bit. But my readers don't have access to that data. Even if I link to the journal article, very often the journal is behind a paywall, so the public can't read it and can't see how that research was done. And even if they can get through the paywall, the journal articles are often written in a way that the public can't really understand what's going on or even analyze to think if that was a well-done article or not. They have to rely on me to do that for them. And I think I think in this day and age that's really not an adequate way to communicate information to the public. This was started by a woman in Washington, D.C., and she was disturbed by the fact that if she wanted to find out what was happening with crime in her neighborhood, she couldn't find out from the Washington Post. And local TV and radio did a little bit better job, but again, it was like catch as catch can. You would maybe not hear a report and things like that. And we all want to know what's happening with crime in our neighborhood, right? Especially if you live in Washington, D.C., which has a crime problem. So what she did is she got the police blotters from the D.C. Police Department and put them into a database and said, here's all the murders that are happening in Washington, D.C., many of which were never reported by the mainstream media. And she not only did that, but she created a way for people in neighborhoods to contribute and comment. So she just basically put the raw data up there and let people annotate it, comment, and add to it as they chose. And it is the best crime reporting in Washington, D.C. right now. This could be a model for crime reporting in every city in the country. And she's basically doing it for nothing. The site costs her very little, and it's something that she thought was an important public service. So here's my challenge to you. Why couldn't we be doing similar things with medical reporting, with science reporting? Why couldn't we be opening up the data to people to look at, comment on, chop up the way they wanted, and in the process create a collaborative understanding of science? I'd like to see that happen. I'd like to figure out how to make something like that happen. This is another interesting project that I think was really great. It was started by a journalist in North Carolina called Kevin Zelnio, and he started just on Twitter, just for fun. He said he was thinking about his own struggle with what to do with himself as a scientist. Was he a writer? Was he a scientist? Was he a science communicator? And so he started this Twitter conversation called I Am Science. And hundreds of people joined in and said, well, here was my path, here's my struggle on how I decided, am I a scientist? If so, why, and how I got there. And he decided that he wanted to do something with these stories. They were wonderful stories about life and science, or life deciding, I'm not a scientist, and why. So he got on this website called Kickstarter. Who knows what Kickstarter is? Who's seen that? Okay, great. You are plugged in. The idea with Kickstarter is that you have a project, you need some seed money, and so you're going to appeal to the public. And it's gotten a lot of criticism because the best way to get money on Kickstarter is to make yourself a really beautiful video promo piece, ideally that would have, Scarlett Johansson in it. But Kevin's he did a really nice simple trailer, And he said, I just want $3,500 to make an ebook out of these I Am Science stories. And within a very short amount of time, he more than doubled that amount of money in little tiny contributions from people. So he's going to go ahead with that. And he also is collaborating with a group in New York called Story Collider that gathers stories from people, and they've made these into videos, which you can now see online, and they're really quite wonderful. But it was a very simple project, really cost-effective, assembled with Kickstarter and Twitter, and I think it's really created a new opening and an avenue, particularly for younger people, if they're thinking, who does scientists? Is like, old white guys who look like Albert Einstein but with better haircuts? No, if you think most scientists, if you go into any lab now, the people you're going to see there, they're 27, 28 years old and they look pretty cool. So let's hear from those scientists and see what they have to say for themselves. So that's what I have to say, and I'd love to hear about your experiences here in Israel and how this future of science reporting and science communication is moving forward. So I'd love to hear questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for this wonderful talk. We only have time for 2 questions, unfortunately. So go ahead.
Talk a little bit about the transition to online, as opposed to print journals. That's happened for a little while now. I'm wondering if you had any information about what people are looking at online. Are they still reading articles, print articles online? Are they more looking at videos? Are they, down things to listen to? Are they things? So I'm trying to get a message out about science. So if I come from print journalism, I'm focused on finding reporters to write articles. Maybe really the best way is I need to put together an audio track about a research that I'm trying to promote or something like that. Or a video is going to be more, reach more people. I'm wondering if you notice something like that.
The answer is yes. And I think that's what's so hard about this, that there's like no magic recipe right now. Robert's been incredibly successful with the podcasts. Planet Money has been incredibly successful with the podcast. Other organizations have had miserable failures with podcasts because it's if you look at the total audience figures in the United States, only a pretty small percentage of people are listening to podcasts on any given day. A huge number of people are watching cable TV, but that's a very expensive, difficult entry point. And I think we're interested in, where we can fit in. Video is huge, particularly with younger people. Video is more expensive to produce. Unless you're going to crowdsource it, which is something I'm doing with this new project with NPR. We're going to try to, we're going to have a video contest with young people talking about what's their big idea for a project that would change the world. And I started doing in-house produced video at the Intel Science Fair a few weeks ago, asking 15, 16, 17-year-olds that question. And you usually say, what's your big idea to change the world? They're just like, boom, they're all over it. They know exactly what they want to do to change the world. So the only way we could figure out how to ask that question in a larger sense was to have a contest on YouTube. I don't know if it's going to work, but I figured it was worth a try. I love print. I'm a writer, and so I think there's still a place for high-quality print. I think we're seeing trends of people being much more interested now in long-form journalism online and really high-quality storytelling, and I hope that's true. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Oh, absolutely. I think we're already seeing that. Yeah. I think if you look at the data on blogs, science blogs have always been really robust and, are a big section of the blogging world. And I think that there's a recognition amongst people who are interested in science issues that this is a forum. This is whether it's on a traditional blog platform or on something like Tumblr, which is more visual, where you can have these in-depth conversations. And maybe social media like Facebook and Twitter lead people to those platforms, but the conversation isn't happening in Facebook and Twitter. It's happening in these deeper formats where I can show you a picture and we can talk about it, or I can publish something that's 10,000 words long, and people do read long-form journalism online. I mean, it's happening now. So I think that that's a really rich possibility. Then you have the larger question of how people will find your things, but I think we're getting much, much better at that, at creating these communities in real life and on the web that then will point people in the direction you want them to go and get those communities formed online too. So
I think that's a point, that's a place we can state that we have some of Israel's leading science bloggers sitting right here in the second line, and their wonderful work is really helping promote science journalism in Israel, because some of it drifts into the more conventional old media.
I'm really excited to hear about that.
Okay. Thanks again, Nancy Shute, for the talk.